institutions meant to protect them. AAMC condemns all violence, bias, aggression, and discrimination based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, and religion. It is important to listen and learn together, and to also take action to make change a reality. AAMC's commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access will continue to be a driving force of all our efforts. We call upon cultural organizations and the individuals working, funding, and serving them to take action to do better. We are dedicated to an environment in which all individuals are treated with respect and dignity at our programs. Each individual has the right to be in a professional atmosphere that prohibits discriminatory practices, including harassment. Our full code of conduct policy for this webinar and all our programs, as well as the outlets to make direct or anonymous report of violation, has been posted in the chat feature. For many years, we have been presenting virtual programming and documenting live events, all of which are accessible on our website at artcurators.org or our YouTube channel. We hope they provide actionable advice, value, and connectivity. You can also stay up to date on our programming by registering for our communications. We are grateful to all our attendees for making space in their schedule to join us. I also want to acknowledge our members here today and express our gratitude to them for their dedication in being part of our community. We give thanks to our speakers for sharing their experiences and knowledge in today's candid and open forum. Thank you again for joining us. And now to begin our program.
Good afternoon. My name is Alex Mann, and I am the curator of prints and drawings at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. And I am so excited to welcome you all to thank AAMC for our panel this afternoon, a possible new future for internships and fellowships, part 2. So what does part 2 mean? Part 2 means that there was a part 1. Some of you may have joined us for that, and it included some of our panelists today. And this happened back in late June. And we said we had a really great discussion about where our field is going, how things are changing as we move in many cases and still remain in an all virtual environment. And how can we continue the programs that we do that feed the pipeline and support emerging professionals in our work in the curatorial and wider museum field. So this originally started because I was attending another AAMC panel and raised the question that I thought it would be a great idea if AAMC offered something to help those of us who were transitioning and thinking about whether or not we could transition internship and fellowship programs that are traditionally on site into an all virtual and all remote model. What would that look like? What would the advantages and disadvantages be from that? What resources would it require? And how would it make us shift our whole perspective on this aspect of our role in the world as museums? And so very cruelly, AAMC turned around and said, well, we think that you should help us organize that. So here I am today. And I am joined by a great group of people that I'm excited for you all to get to know a little bit better. So we have Hillary Walter, who is the manager of academic programs at LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Deandra Lawson, who is a curatorial assistant, also there at LACMA. My colleague down the street in Washington, Sara, who is the program administrator in the Department of Academic Programs at the National Gallery of Art, and Caryl McFarlane, who is a higher education consultant and works with the Alliance of Historically Black College and University Museums and Galleries. Thank you all so much for being here. And I want to start by giving each of you a chance to tell us a little bit more about why you're here on this panel. What has been your relationship, your institution's engagement with moving fellowship and internship programs from an in-person to a virtual model? And I'd like to invite Hillary to start, please.
Sure. Thanks for having us and organizing the panel, Alex. So I think one of the things that I've been working on at LACMA is our Mellon undergraduate curatorial fellowship program. I also help a little bit with the ASU program, which Deandra is a fellow on, as well as our LEAP fellowship that was supported by the Ford Foundation and the Walton Family Foundation. But the main crux of what I was focusing on this summer and from March onwards with COVID was helping our 4 Mellon undergraduate curatorial fellows at LACMA transition from in-person to virtual fellowships, and particularly during the summer when they are full-time in their departments. So a lot of it was creating more timelines and being really explicit about expectations, also being flexible and finding that balance. I think all of us can relate to of online fatigue, but also making sure they were still having a rich experience in the museum. So looking forward to sharing more with the group.
Hillary, thank you. Deandra.
Thanks, Alex. And I also just wanted to thank the AAMC and Judith and Monica Valenzuela and you, Alex, again for inviting me to participate in the discussion today. But yes, as colleague of Hillary's at LACMA, I'm also curatorial assistant in LACMA's Wallace Annenberg Photography Department. And I'm in the 3rd and final year of my LACMA Arizona State University Master's Fellowship in Art History. And this was a fellowship that, unlike the Mellon model for undergraduate students, in which students were having to transition from an in-person model to a remote model, my program was always designed to be sort of this hybrid model. So it was founded in 2018, and it was designed to be a way to bridge the university and the academy, or the university and the museum, pardon me, so that full-time employees at LACMA and at Arizona State University Art Museum could earn an advanced degree while they were working. So I'm here today to bring the perspective of a fellow really to speak and brainstorm with you all how we can continue to innovate these programs that bring professional and opportunities and real pathways for emergent professionals.
Deandra, thank you so much. Caryl.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks again to Alex and AAMC and my distinguished colleagues on this panel. Thank you for taking time out of your day, which has probably already been full of Zoom meetings, to participate in yet another Zoom meeting. But hopefully this one will be a little more fun. So as the executive consultant for the Alliance of HBCU Museums and Galleries, we had 3 programs planned for the summer. One of those was a curatorial program, which unfortunately we had to cancel since it was reliant upon in-person experiences and interactions with murals that are in Texas. But the other 2 programs we were able to transition to a virtual platform. That was our conservation program and our archival program. So I'm looking forward to speaking with you all a bit more about that.
Caryl, thank you so much. And Sara, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Alex, for moderating this conversation, and for Monica and Judith and AAMC for having us. So my name is Sara, and I work at the National Gallery. For the last 2 years, I've managed the Museum Assistance Program, and that was with the help of a small working group. So if anyone in education's in the audience, I wanted to give you guys a shout out. This program is a pre-professional work experience for DC residents ages 18 to 21. So this program is recruited and paid through the DC government's Marin Berry Summer Youth Employment Program. And so I'll be talking about how this opportunity engages local high school students as well as undergraduate students about careers in the museum field, emphasizing transferable skills that they can take anywhere, such as time management, public speaking, customer service, and research skills. And it also allows them to meet artists on staff so they can see how creatives balance a day job. And I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you all.
Sarah, thank you so much. So as you all can see, we are a diverse group that is here today to have a conversation and to be a resource for you all. We are curators, we are administrators, and all of us, I think, within the museum world wear many different hats when it comes to the question of how do we train and prepare our future colleagues to come and join us or to be our fellow curators or professionals in whatever role at other institutions. And so I hope that by having a little bit of an introduction to where we are all coming from, you all can start to think of some questions and topics that you want to hear us talk about, because there will be a Q&A portion at the latter half of our conversation today. So a little bit about structure. I've got some questions prepared. We've got some issues that I want to hear each of us talk about, and some of these will be sort of reflections and updates as folks who have now been through a summer of working with these transitions and understanding how the new models that we're working with today are, in some cases, offering advantages that we didn't expect or problems that we didn't expect. So we're going to talk a little bit about our experiences, not necessarily telling you that anything that our institutions have done is the best way, but knowing that the more ideas that we can put out on the table, as well as problems and questions we've been facing, is going to help the whole community move into these new possibilities and brainstorm and reinvent everything that we're doing with more ideas and possibilities and some resources in mind. So with that in hand, I want to invite you all to use the Q&A feature at any point during our conversation to give us your questions and ideas, and then we'll come a point when we transition and try to address as many of those as possible within our conversation today. And we'll be following up and trying to give you more resources and answer some of the additional questions that come up after the program with some follow-up emails, sending you some links and resources and other content. And you'll find some great things on the Association of Art Museum Curators website as well that I invite you to explore as much as possible after today's event. So to start off the conversation a little bit, I've asked each of our panelists to reflect on one or two particular advantages or surprises that they have encountered this summer. I think we all assume that the transition from the in-person interaction and hands-on experience that we love so much, we expect that transition to take a lot of things away from us, but I think there have been some cases where there have been positives, and I'd like to hear everybody offer kind of one or two of those from your experience. Let's start with Hillary again.
Sure. I think a positive, particularly one of the events that I manage and organize for the Mellon program is a national convening where all of the fellows across the 6 partner museums get together every summer. And we weren't able to gather in person in Philadelphia, but we did transition that event to online. And I think a lot more individuals from each of the partner museums attended the event as a result, because they didn't have to travel and be with us in person. So it was this idea of like the virtual allowed the event to be more accessible to more individuals, which was a nice surprise.
Yeah, I think accessibility is one of the great benefits or opportunities of being remote. I know that I live in Washington, D.C., which is a very expensive city, especially if you are someone who is in school and in training. And I hope this is a topic that we'll come back to more because this is going to be, I think, an ongoing theme of programs of this type. So, Deandra.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to really, extend that theme or echo that theme or reiterate it because as I mentioned, my program was already working remotely. So I'm working full-time at the museum, but then also I'm attending my my graduate seminars remotely. So that model, that technology was kind of already in place. So when the pandemic hit, there was less of that adjustment period for us fellows who are participating in the program. We had functionally already been doing that. So summer really became a time for us entering our third year to really focus in on our thesis. I want to talk really quickly about an experience I had refiguring my externship that was planned for this summer, but really just, again, to echo that I think the possibilities for collaboration and partnerships across virtual space is a huge advantage that we should constantly be thinking about and innovating. I'm excited for the potential for more and more sort of hybrid programs, I hope, to emerge around the country to give more opportunities to students. But getting back to a specific anecdote, I had planned this summer as part of my fellowship to travel. My research has brought me to contemporary African diasporic art production. And I had a travel grant. I had my interviews lined up. I was ready to go, really excited. I'd been working with my mentor on setting up meetings, et cetera. And of course, I had to cancel everything. And so what to do? This was not only my main activity as part of my fellowship this summer, but also integral to my thesis research. And so I put together a budget and proposed to repurpose those funds to provide our artists that I'm interviewing, that I'd planned to interview, stipends. And of course, even though some of those makers are based in Dakar, Senegal, or in Europe, I was still able to schedule the Zoom meeting. And then was able to then, in an arts ecology, felt it was meaningful to offer these emergent artists functionally an honoraria for their time in meeting with me and interviewing with me. So it was a way of kind of making lemonade out of the situation. But, I'm hopeful, that, externship and travel opportunities are so important for fellows. And I'm hopeful for a future we're able to do that again. But in the meantime, I think there's meaningful ways that we can continue dialogues across international lines and border lines.
Deandra, thank you so much. That speaks really well to this question of geography and accessibility. But I think what you also are raising really creatively is how this impacts resources. And those are resources of budget, which might need to be shifted or repurposed, and also resources of time. And I think that that's something that we all are going to be thinking about a lot, in that a Zoom meeting and participation in something like even our panel today is not the same as traveling to another part of the country to take part in a conference. But at the same time, it is really important that we recognize how we are drawing, especially when we're working with experts or artists, on their time, and being able to recognize that is something we shouldn't be taking for granted. So we're going to come back to some of those questions. And now I'll shift to Caryl. You're working with two different programs, and so might have a couple of anecdotes for us of what's gone well, what have been some surprises.
The advantages are, the three big ones for both of the programs are actually each of the things that you just mentioned. So cost savings, obviously, since for both programs, we had a number of students who we would have had to pay for their travel, housing, and food. None of those costs obviously came up since they were able to participate at home virtually. The second big advantage was what Deandra mentioned, and that's the feasibility of being able to engage with speakers and have speakers who are in different parts of the world and the country, which otherwise wouldn't have been feasible. And then the incredible facility of partnerships, since, as you pointed out, Alex, time is a significant factor. If a partner would have had to travel, take time out of possibly cancel an entire day or two of work in order to just give an hour or so presentation versus being able to just come on to Zoom, present for the time, answer questions, and then get back to their affairs. So those were the three big advantages that I saw.
Caryl, thank you so much. Yeah, I think we're all beginning to sort of internalize what opportunities and what doors are opening when programs that are at the core of our operations have the rules changed and some of these doors opened in terms of who can participate and also who we can reach out to and use as a resource or a question. Sara, you have been working really closely with a program that is already relatively geographically specific, but tell us a little bit more about that and what you've learned.
Yes, so commute time's cut in half. That's a great advantage. But seriously, the greatest takeaway that I had this summer is working in new ways. And so I have two examples. One, so the museum assistants last summer, they worked on engaging with the visitor. That in-person experience was really important for learning customer service skills, presenting oneself, researching the collection. But this year we completely scrapped that approach and focused on a creative research project. So this allowed us to work with different colleagues from across the museum to allow the students to pick an artist with local ties, so they could research someone on staff or an artist in the permanent collection, and they can ultimately create a podcast recording or an Instagram story. This was new content that we didn't provide last year, so it was a totally different experience, and I was really excited about that. The other major change was that everyone was learning how to work online and work remotely. So if someone on staff did not know how to share their screen, museum assistants felt like they were colleagues on the same level. The hierarchy was kind of shifted. So I wanted to make a note of that as well.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, if we look at the screen right now, we see that all the boxes are exactly the same size. And there's a really wonderful, I think, an empowering leveling that can happen that could be really helpful when we are in a mentorship situation with someone who is coming into the field that is very different than when you're in the classroom or even in someone's office in terms of those dynamics and the way a conversation is structured. So this is all really encouraging, but I know that the road has not been very easy. So on the other side, I want to hear, just to get the ideas flowing, what have been some of the biggest disappointments, or what has, in the case of your particular program, been the most painful sacrifice? And I'll start again with Hillary.
Sure. Yeah, I think the biggest sacrifice has been not being in the museum together and looking at art and sharing time, talking to curators, looking at objects, or even going into storage. I know one of our fellows was brave enough to go into storage with her mentor, but, we all kind of had some reservations and we're very cautious about that. It went smoothly and it was fine, but, again, it's realizing we wanted to be safe as well. So I think that's one of the biggest, kind of disadvantages of our current moment.
Yeah, some of those things are just completely irreplaceable, and I think we're going to be cataloging what those are at each of our individual institutions or within the programs, and really understanding them in a different way. Deandra, what has been the
Yeah, I mean, I would say, again, obviously I just mentioned the travel opportunities. That was a huge disappointment. But I was happy that I was able to repurpose the funds in a different way. But certainly there is really no substitute for in-person kind of mentorship. But I will say, I've always worked with my thesis committee and my mentor throughout my, I'm now approaching into my third year. And there's something about the remote learning or technology that makes one feel like they should be checking in more often. Like somehow it increases or augments the urgency of like checking in. And so I just want to say that I feel like I'm maybe more often meeting with my mentor or having more one-on-one conversations with them, more extended conversations with them and my thesis committee, maybe that I would have otherwise, or just to say that while the in-person is not possible for the moment, although before the pandemic, I was going back to Arizona to touch ground, that's still, there are regular and routine check-ins that are meaningful.
And I think that's one of the things I've struggled with. So with my, I'll just say really quickly, I am working with remote interns. I had 2 over the summer, one here in DC and the other far away in Boston. And again, I'm in that situation where this fall I've just started work with 2 interns, one in DC, one working out of South Bend. And we're figuring out the structure. How often do we meet? What kind of reporting? And I think that that is something that has a kind of personality dynamic to it in terms of what do you need as someone who wants to manage a particular project or convey a set of skills and experiences, and then also for the student, for the person on the other end, and figuring out that that dance in a way is a different strategy than it is within the building. So it's going to be a long road for us, but lots to learn. Caryl.
Thank you, Alex. So the biggest disappointment that I found for both the archival program and the conservation program were those focal activities which normally take place in person. And those were, for the conservation program specifically, was a disappointment and a near disaster. And that is the flower pot project, which I'm sure much of my audience is familiar with, where essentially you have a flower pot, you break it deliberately, and then you have to consolidate and in paint. There were numerous issues that developed. The students did not have the proper materials. They could not follow the verbal instructions which were given to try to complete the project successfully. They, of course, then were very frustrated. So though the online learning portions went very well, that particular project, which was, of course, supposed to be an essential aspect of their hands-on learning component, as much as we could make it hands-on virtually, did not go well. So that is definitely lesson learned. And then for the archival program, really it wasn't as dramatic or drastic, but it was the lack of course, being able to handle those original documents in person, and instead just seeing them online, seeing an image of them. And sometimes those images weren't so accurate. So that made for some difficulty.
Caryl, just to follow up, in both of those cases, do you see those as particular aspects of the program that may be tried again? Like with a recipe and you don't get it right the first time, you will give it another go? Or have these both been situations where you said, well, we just really need to start over with a new model or a different program? And I think that's, we can each translate that into our own situation.
No, in each case, we thought lessons learned. How could we have done this so that it would have been effective? So for the conservation program, we said, well, we could have had a synchronous session where the instructor actually went through the process of breaking the flower pot and had all of the students follow her lead while she was doing it, so that any questions that came up or difficulties which arose could be answered immediately as opposed to the students floundering on their own. Also, another huge issue there was in the materials, which I know we haven't gotten to that yet, but the supplies, which we were supposed to have sent, we did not time out well enough to be able to purchase and mail in time for the start of the program. So that was a huge drawback and something, lesson learned, to learn about our timing, knowing that this is critically important. No, the students are not necessarily in places where they can just go to the store and get some of the things on the list. And in fact, none of them could. So now we know, okay, next time, if we have to do this again, which unfortunately it looks like we may, then we will make sure that we purchase all of the supplies ahead of time, mail them out to the students, and then set up some kind of synchronous session. And then the archival fix, so to speak, is not as involved. It just simply entails being sure that the images that are being provided actually show the entire document and no part of the information is missing.
That's good to know. And I think that's really exciting to hear how brave it is to take something and say, wow, this didn't turn out at all the way we wanted. And you've really got two choices of just stopping or to really scrutinize and say, how can we push through or restructure in order to stick with the program and really believe in certain parts of the curriculum. And that's not to say that anything can continue 100%, but I applaud the folks that you're working with for taking on that challenge and giving those opportunities to the students in the best ways possible. So, Sara, tell us about, give us the sad story.
So museum assistants are DC residents ages 18 to 21. A lot of them have not been to the museum since their first grade field trip. None had participated in an education program up to that point. So it was a little difficult at times when staff would say, oh, I wish you were here to see this, or I wish you were here to see that, because they simply had no frame of reference. And at times it felt frustrating. One example is the behind the scene tours. Last summer, we were able to bring them through all these VIP sessions. And this year we tried to translate it in a way that they could do some close looking at some high res images. And then we mailed supplies so that they could begin to understand the artistic practice or process. So for watercolors, we had watercolor pencils and water brushes shipped to them, and they were able to play around a couple afternoons in a week to learn about and to experiment with the materials. But it's just not the same as seeing the works in person, and I look forward to them visiting when they can, whenever we're able to have them in person. The other disadvantage just in general was communication. Not every student had the capacity to have their video camera on. And so as someone that's facilitating conversations between staff who have not really worked with young people before, it was hard to get a pulse. I wasn't able to make eye contact with every single student to make sure that they understood. Ways around it, I had them react. So they did thumbs up when they understood what was going on. If they had questions, they raised their hand. So I tried to use some of the Zoom features to our advantage. This also helped when students were not as, they weren't as vocal, or they were intimidated or nervous. Those are positives, but in the overall day-to-day, it was hard to communicate because sometimes I simply could not see them.
No, that makes perfect sense. I mean, this really is a test of our creativity and our attitudes as we approach all these situations in new ways. So with that in mind, I wanted to start by kind of directing us to some of the planning processes for folks whose institutions may not yet have tackled this, or even if we have, coming around to it again. And I asked folks to think a little bit about budget. And if you are setting up a budget and asking for resources from your institution, everything is stretched so thin right now. What are some of the fundamental needs or unexpected needs of this? And Caryl spoke about that. So I'm going to turn it back to her for just a second.
Sure. So we did not anticipate, as I said, just how important it would be for the students to have the proper supplies. And so that is not something which had been in the budget and would therefore need to be budgeted, as well as mailing those supplies to the students in different parts of the country. We would have had to budget for that as well. And we had not anticipated that. The other component, which was a little bit of a surprise, was the internet connectivity. Not all of the students had strong internet, as Sara was pointing out, and we did want to be able to see them. So we did have to cover the cost in some instances for Wi-Fi for a few months. Those were the two big expenses that were a surprise. But since we had saved money and we were working with a grant that we'd already received for the conservation program. So since we had saved so much in the travel and housing and food that we did not have to expend money for, we had the money in the budget. We just didn't spend it because we didn't time it correctly.
Yeah, that's so tricky, and must be something difficult. I think one of the questions is going to be, what are the resources that we can use in order to estimate for things like mailing and the amount of time that's going to take, and what the timetable is going to be of putting those extra steps as well as the extra money into the particular program. Sara, can you follow up on this a little bit with what you all were working on?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, this program is paid through the DC government. So the DC government decided 3 weeks out that it would start the program 1 week early and virtual. So that was just a fun, and that's why I gave a shout out to the working group, because whew, that was an intense month. So we normally do not have a budget for this program. It's paid through the DC government. And so as we were trying to be nimble and think of ways to engage the museum assistants with the artistic practice or process, we thought of mailing them supplies. And so thankfully the education division used funds that were not going to be used for programming for this expense. But I simply didn't have time to think through all the logistics. So we mailed out a couple of times different supplies that we thought, oh, this would be good for them to use. And 1 week into the program, our colleagues in the library division, they said, oh, we have all the supplies we can donate. And I was not going to say no to that. So I next time will make sure I knew what could be mailed when, and make it as least expensive as possible.
I just want to say kudos to you, Sara. It sounds like an incredible effort, and so amazing that that you saw that all through. I wanted to add, as part of my experience as a fellow, I no longer had access to library. So for any sort of research based projects, I was then working with the librarians at my university to mail books to me. So just another in thinking through budgets and line items, but that's something else to consider, at least in this moment, while most of our public libraries, et cetera, are still closed.
Deandra, that's a really good point you bring up about libraries and other resources that are outside of some of our immediate colleagues in the museum. I feel like some of the librarians I've been working with have been heroes lately, not only to my interns in order to facilitate the kind of research work that I've been asking them to do, but to me personally in my own work in terms of the shifting and getting those resources moved around. And I'm wondering if any of you all have reflections on other folks that you've been in conversation with for advice or guidance and new ideas outside of your immediate colleagues and normal circles in order to facilitate and transition some of these programs.
I actually have the luxury of having kind of 5 partners in crime on the Mellon program, because each of our partner institutions has a coordinator on site. So we usually would have normal like monthly phone calls to check in, see how things are going, make sure we were kind of all kind of in step and doing similar things together, and also, you know, sharing tips and advice with one another. But definitely when we all went to shelter in place and being safer at home, we had weekly phone calls in order to just, you know, keep in touch with each other, make sure everybody was doing okay, and also, you know, prepare for the summer and making that transition together, which was invaluable.
Hillary, thanks. Yeah, jump in, Sara.
So the program is through the larger summer youth employment program. So I was able to ask colleagues in the library, DC Public Library. I mean, that program hosts 10,000 youth. So people are getting jobs in private sectors, federal government, summer camps, really any job you can get in DC. And so I didn't have all those contacts, but I had a liaison who could help me if I did have a question, or the people that I just knew that were in the program already. So I definitely would give a plug. Your local library has a ton of workshops that are free. And if there's a specific resource that you need.
Thanks, Sara. So just to keep things moving along, because we've got a lot of ground, and I know we're not going to be able to cover every single aspect of this, but one of the fundamentals of any kind of our interactions right now is using these platforms like Zoom for our communications. And whether you're working with one person or a group, a cohort, a class, that really changes the dynamic and the type of conversation. And we've talked a little bit already about the leveling and the benefits from this potentially. And I'd love to hear some more stories and reflections on just managing these conversations over these platforms and what that has opened up, or anything that you might recommend folks avoid.
I could just quickly say that you know, again, this idea of the virtual expanding networks or and flattening sort of hierarchies out. It's been meaningful for me to participate or to attend meetings with my mentor and really feel member and included in a way that maybe in person might not feel as welcome or comfortable. We talked about how certain social cues, such as who's at the head of the table or eye contact, are sort of equalized in the grid, if you will. But I think, you know, as maybe as eerie or bizarre as that might sound, on the plus side, I think it really can create and open up opportunities for fellows at any level, graduate or undergraduate levels, to really feel welcome to join in and participate, or to shadow. I mean, what is it really to send someone a link to a Zoom meeting that you're organizing and have them listen in, rather than sort of another body in a room. So I think there's ways that we can behave more inclusively with this platform.
Deandra, thank you. Sara, can you tell us a little bit more about those the conversations and dynamics with your group? Are they meeting together at times, and then also one-on-one? How is that balance working out?
Yeah, so 2 meetings a day. I tried not to give them 5 Zoom meetings. No one likes that. So 2 meetings a day, they would meet with colleagues from across the museum. And this would be, just like we're in right now, a group meeting. And then at the end of the day, to create sort of the social dynamics, normally you do an art making activity or read a blog post that a fellow NGA staff wrote. You would break out into breakout rooms. And so you would talk to your peers in smaller groups. And I think this allowed the museum assistants to feel like they could share a little more than maybe they would if they were in a larger group. But I was curious to know if anyone else used breakout rooms, what they used it for, because I primarily used it as a way for the museum assistants to become more comfortable speaking out loud. We all forget that this is nerve-wracking as it is, let alone being in the room with experts. So yeah, just wanted to hear what you all thought.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that, Sarah, thank you. We did use breakout rooms, and actually that was one of the most effective tools. So we partnered with, in the archival program, we partnered with the museum also on campus and asked them to do a curatorial session. And much to the chagrin of the archival group, the museum workshop was the most popular and the ones that the students enjoyed the most. And I think part of that is because they used breakout rooms so effectively. So we had a general overview, which was brief. Something else about communications, I think, to keep in mind is that the students' attention to listening to a lecture in this kind of format is much more limited than it is in person. So we tried to keep it to like 15 minutes maybe for an introduction. And then we broke them out into breakout rooms where they each got to closely observe a particular work on paper, which they loved. With a curator, it was groups of 2 or 3 students in each little room. They each discussed the piece. The curator would give some kind of background and historical context on the piece and the artist, and the process of creation, and a little bit the provenance. And then they would dig in, and they absolutely loved it. Absolutely loved it. And the few archival sessions where we also incorporated breakout rooms, those also were the most popular for that component of the program.
Caryl, I'm really curious in terms of just a logistical question in trying to translate this experience of working really directly with these objects and artifacts. Was that a live sharing of the object by the curator or the facilitator over Zoom, or of a still image that was presented?
It was a still image presented. It was not a live sharing because their museum was closed. So they wouldn't have been able to do live sharing, but they did share the still image. And then the students, one of the parts of Zoom that I think is also beneficial is the students are able to quickly jump onto the internet and look up additional resources to help them if they had questions about a particular aspect of the piece, or, well, what magazine was that in, or who was that in? So I thought that really made for much livelier discussions, and I would hesitate to say a closer engagement with the object than they would have had in person, but certainly those smaller groupings of students and curator looking at a particular object, even though it was a still image, at least in the sessions that I sat in on, really seemed to move the discussions in a way that I hadn't seen in in-person interactions, which was interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a question that we're all facing, is how can we best both be logistically simple in terms of managing these types of experiences, and then also do what we expect to be more engaging and real and direct in these conversations and interactions, whether it's just something person to person or if it is introducing some other aspect of museum work like engagement with an object, and to try to find the balance between those two, or to get ideas from other institutions of what is working with what's working well for them. I think that also leads to a question that we've been talking about in terms of group interaction, of how to better facilitate and recreate these networks and the sense of a cohort and interaction and sense of community among these interns when they're not getting to necessarily, unless we're creating it, have those opportunities for conversation and learning from each other. And that's a question that was in part raised by someone already in our chat. I'm trying to transition a little bit now between all the questions that I want to ask and the questions that I know you all have for our panelists. So feel free to keep adding your questions as well, and I'll start addressing some of those to our group.
I mean, I would just say among my cohort, I mean, I've really gotten to know my fellows, some of whom were already colleagues of mine at LACMA, so I already knew them. But for those that I were meeting at the, for the first time, I mean, I think the same social rules still apply. I mean, I got to know them through really dynamic conversations and seminars. And I think as we're trying to find ways to animate objects without being in front of objects, I mean, we can still always turn to the literature. We can still turn to the scholarship to engage in ideas. And I think, as Caryl mentioned, in sort of intimate groups or small groups, you can really have meaningful conversations that engage the object, but then that also, form more social bonds. And so there's less, it kind of happens more organically. It's less they're less orchestrated, convenings that rather that just sort of happen organically. So I think really always bringing folks together around or in dialogue around a piece of writing is a great way to create connection and exchange of ideas. So those rules still apply.
I just want to follow up on that, Deandra. That's a great point. One of the things that also seemed to work very well was office hours. So we gave all the students, obviously they had a reading list for each of the programs, both the archival and the conservation program. And in the archival program, the team thought of the idea of office hours. And in those office hours, it would allow the students to ask questions about the given reading for the week before the synchronous session occurred. And those discussions really did help to do exactly what you described, Deandra, and that is connect the students with each other as well as with the particular staff members who were engaged with them discussing the material that they had read or about which they had questions. We also tried to deliberately work on the cohort notion in the conservation program by engaging a TA. And she reached out to all of the student participants after each session and before the sessions, both individually and as a group. So they would have group discussions amongst themselves without any of us participating or being involved. And we could always tell when that happened around a particular topic, because then when we had the synchronous session, they were all talking, oh, do you remember you said so-and-so about such and such? No, you said that, which was lovely, It was lovely to observe that kind of dynamic, even though it was a virtual platform. So that did seem to help to mitigate the lack of in-person connection for the cohort.
And maybe that's something that is going to get easier for all of us just as we all get more comfortable with these ways of interacting with other people. And as the same happens for our students. I mean, I certainly feel differently about working with folks over Zoom now than I did last March. And so that's encouraging for all of us, and for the idea that as we work with groups, they'll take advantage of these technologies on their own terms. We were thinking a little bit about, as we restructure and move these programs into the future, what types of experiences are we giving to the students that really are successful if we are kind of creating a hybrid model? Some of us will be trying to bring students back into our institutions in the future. And I'm going to start with Hillary on this. I think your Mellon Fellows last year were in the building and got to know each other, really got a one-on-one sense of cohort, and then went virtual. What's going to happen next year? Do you know yet? Or
well, I have
share what you
two.
can.
Yeah, I have two that are still continuing, and it's kind of rough for them because as a result of COVID, our weekly intensive program where we would have picked our two new fellows was canceled or postponed until next summer instead, which may have to be a hybrid model. But those two fellows are continuing alone. We would normally have 4. So I'm actually going to be working with our counterparts across the country. And one of the things we did in advance of that national convening event this summer, knowing that we weren't going to get the 24 fellows together in person, we were strategically kind of doing, one museum and one museum group, like on a weekly basis, having Zoom meetings together so they could get to start forming this larger cohort. So, that's something we're like, why haven't we done that all along? But being virtual had forced us to do that. And I think that's something we'll actually continue with the 12 that are going into their second year now. We'll find a way where they can have like a monthly call where they can still maintain that contact and build those relationships as a group.
That's really exciting. And, it's something that the museum, the organizer, can set up some of these opportunities, but you sort of hope that some of this will happen naturally or organically as well, because I think in many cases, as with any situation where interns and fellows come together, the future beyond that is impossible to predict and really up to their ambition in a lot of ways. Though it doesn't hurt for us to suggest and plant some of the seeds for that, even if we as an institution step back and let them move on to the next stage in their development and careers. Thinking a little bit more about geography and how we connect and make our resources available to a wider set of folks, whether that's geography across the country, but also spaces in terms of class and resources and availability and access to our organizations. I'm curious how folks are advertising and presenting these programs going forward, knowing that some of the previous barriers to being a participant are taken away. And if you have any strategies or opportunities or questions regarding that aspect of a positive from this situation. And Caryl, I'm going to put you on the spot with this because I know you're working with several different institutions that are institutions of higher ed that may have brought folks back to campus, maybe not. And so that's a focus community in some ways, but also it is a community that in and of itself is changing its boundaries a little bit. Is this something that's coming up with some of the organizations you're helping?
Absolutely. Of course, for all of us, we are hoping and trying to plan for next summer's set of programs, but we are not sure if we're going to be in person or not, if it's going to, again, have to be virtual or actually what we're planning to do at this point is a hybrid. I know you mentioned hybrid, so we thought if we could combine the best of what we were able to glean from the virtual platform and have, say, a week or so of content, which is virtual, and then some time period in person, even if that is abbreviated because of whatever the COVID situation may be at that point. Even if we have to limit the numbers of students, we really think it important to have an in-person following the virtual. And so part of what we actually did even this summer for the conservation program in particular was have those students who participated in the program connected with a conservator, if at all possible, who was in their vicinity or to whose studio they could drive, so that they would actually be able to see what this looks like, what it feels like, because of course that's such an important part of this process. And since those interactions were one-on-one, that was permissible as opposed to a group. So those are some of the ways we're kind of thinking about it at this point, and seeking to plan ahead using some of what we learned from the virtual and hopefully combining that with some kind of in-person experience.
No, that's great. That makes a lot of sense, and is exciting that that these can continue, that they can learn and evolve. Sara, what do you think that's going to look like next at the gallery and the program that you've been facilitating?
Yeah, so one thing that I've been currently grappling with is the idea of like, what can the museum assistants do after? I know that's a little different from what you're asking, but last year we were able to hire all the museum assistants through education programs. They could continue supporting educators with drop-in art activities, community celebrations, some more of that visitor engagement. And this year, the opportunities just aren't there. We're not doing any on-site programming. Everyone's taking a pause and rethinking and reevaluating their program priorities. So I'm just still thinking about ways to engage the students that we have that are really interested really interested at the gallery. And the DC government will mandate whether this will be a hybrid, virtual, or in person. And we're just going to be nimble, and I'll be definitely looking out for hybrid options from you all as I continue to wait to see what the government decides to do.
I just wanted to follow up on the question as well, Alex. And actually, you know, it was a hybrid model of an in-person and a remote, like in a virtual model that is enabling me to earn an advanced degree in the field. And so I really just wanted to advocate again for how can we really exploit this technology to create real opportunities. And for those of us who are overseeing fellows and interns now or into the future, like what are the projects, what are the credentials that they're going to walk away with from that experience, and really use the technology to eliminate barriers. I mean, hopefully, I think this is a moment in which museums are reevaluating and looking at their criteria for roles and how they are seeking talent. And so there's definitely ways we can use Zoom and virtual technology to reach communities, to partner with communities, and to expand networks for our fellows, professional networks for them. So I just wanted to say that that's been meaningful to me personally, and for us all to hopefully think about moving forward.
Deandra, thank you. I think it's really fascinating that you are part of a program that's already had this element in place for years now and some sort of system and structure to work around. And I'm wondering if you could follow up on that a little bit and talk about evaluation and reporting. Because as many of us try out these new structures, we need ways of understanding from the participants, is this working? And so how are you delivering feedback? But then also as institutions for us to interpret that data and that information and to be self-critical as we express within our institution or potentially to outside funders how we're doing with these models. What's that looked like for you?
Well, I'm someone who's, who's worked in the field for a while. So it's not the same as, taking somebody who's fresh out of high school or fresh out of undergrad or who maybe hasn't worked in an office before. I mean, that's very different. And it requires a different set of training and checking in. I have learned to balance my professional work with my academic work throughout the course of being in this program. But in terms of like hard surveys, we have hard check-ins. I have a mentor who I keep mentioning this mentor. She's somebody who's not affiliated with my employer, with LACMA, and she's not affiliated with the academic program. So in this way, it kind of makes her kind of a more neutral third party. And so she's checking in with me for honest feedback. And I think that's something to think about, like how can we employ neutral third parties to survey and to ask, to get more candid feedback, and then to also just be open to learning and improving. As Caryl mentioned her great, story, this summer, and to, really listening to the students and really soliciting their feedback and welcoming it through surveys. And hopefully, even better than a survey is earning their trust over time, so that they feel that they can really open up to you and be honest.
Thanks, Deandra. So how has the reporting gone? I want to hear at other institutions. Sara, is that something that you are gathering information on at the gallery and trying to manage or process? I'm sure your program isn't the only one that's had some of these questions. So what are you looking for in a way as criteria for success?
Great question. So we had pre and post surveys that showed us how we divided their time. How did they liked it, they didn't like it, and whether they felt like they were led to success. But one engagement model we used was this idea of personal meaning mapping. And these meaning mapping activities were done in the first day and the last day. And it was a way for the museum assistants to write down everything they thought of when they thought of the phrase art museum. And so one thing that I thought was very interesting, last summer when we did this, on their last day, the museum assistants sometimes wrote people's names down. They felt such a personal connection with the museum that they associated this person with that experience. But this summer, the map showed that the museum assistants that were new, they associated art museums with specific programs or departments. It's more clinical, didn't associate it with specific people or a specific event, which I just thought was very interesting. And I will be still combing through the post-program survey, but yeah, definitely a great question.
Thanks, Sara. We're nearing the end of our conversation. Thank you all so much for being with us and for all of the great information that you've been sharing, and also for everyone who's asked questions. Something that's come up several times in the Q&A that I'm hoping several of you all can speak to is with the possibilities that are opened up through our internships. what are our institutions doing in order to reach out and recruit and make sure that underrepresented groups know that these opportunities are available to them? Are there any new steps that you're taking or anything that you would particularly recommend? Because I think every institution needs to do better on this, and we're all looking for ideas.
I can easily jump in. I mean, I was lucky. I mean, lots of my recruitment happened before COVID. But what I was able to do, and we'll have to think creatively about what this looks like in the future, is I've built relationships with faculty at local institutions, be it a community college or, you know, a four-year university. And back in, you know, January, long time ago, I went and visited about 6 or 7 of those universities and did a workshop about the program to students. And the luxury with us, you know, now being in our 6th year of having the Mellon program around, I could even tap into previous participants to have them come with me. So that's like an added, you know, bonus of having students who have gone to those universities, then come back, you meet with their peers and tell it, you know, share their experiences of being in the program with them as well, to get them interested in, you know, knowing that this is, you know, a possibility. We'll see if that looks like Zoom meetings and workshops in the future. But I think, you know, there definitely is that community that you can be, you know, reaching out to students, even thinking about, I know in the part 1 of this conversation, one of the colleagues, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name, he shared about, you know, even work study, you know, maybe there's going to be a way for students to take their work study money and bring it to an institution. And, you know, even a student thinking of an independent study project that they can do and still get credit by having, you know, gaining experience in the museum as well. So I think there are, you know, some creative solutions and outreach and in all of that hopefully people can tap into.
I just wanted to add, thank you, Hillary. You hit on the key points for a successful recruitment for any students, really, and particularly those who are from underrepresented backgrounds. So what I always encourage our partners to do is establish relationship, if at all possible. So it's not exactly a new approach, Alex, but it's effective, right? And even if those relationships haven't already been established, like Hillary, you were saying, well, you already had these relationships and you've had the luxury of having this program for 6 years. And I realize some of those who are listening may not be in that kind of position, but those relationships can be built, right? Especially in this particular moment when we have all that is transpiring in our country with our racial unrest because of systemic racism, which has been around for centuries, now being realized by larger portions of the population. People are more open to having conversations. So exactly what you said works. That is reaching out to those who are, start with your neighborhood, those who are in your local community, maybe some partner institutions who happen to be nearby, and reach out, start to build bridges, see if you can start having conversations. But to just send emails or documents or something like that to given institutions, of course, doesn't work as effectively. So even if those meetings have to occur, which they probably will, via Zoom, that at least would start the conversations going. And then from there, you could think about reaching out to some of those students.
Caryl, I think that's really beautiful the way you said that, this idea of reaching out, and for us all to think about how technology will potentially allow us to build relationships even when we can't travel, and to maybe start the conversation for a partnership with an institution that seemed in some ways potentially geographically out of reach or kind of cross some of those other barriers. So thank you for those ideas. We have now hit roughly the end of our 75 minutes, but I want to give a moment to our speakers if you have any final words or thoughts that you want to share before we say goodbye for today. This is your moment.
I just wanted to share one other thing that I wrote down, but we didn't get to cover. One of the things that was great over the summer too was this idea of, and again, it's like you're in the office, we should be doing this already, but a lot of us were using like a Google Drive or a way to share information with each other. And that was really beneficial for us to, even if it's like a shared timeline of, okay, here's the 10-week summer, here's some of the benchmarks of what we want to do. And it was a document we could all share and see and update. And then I know also one of the mentors to our fellows, to kind of to Deandra's point, not having access to a library, this mentor had some of the books at her home, so she would, somehow scan them and then also keep that material in this Google Drive. So understanding, again, using technology tools to our benefit when we can't all be together.
And I just wanted to add, we didn't get to talk about time. If you're hoping to start or create or develop a virtual program, either based on one that used to be in person or something that's just kind of a new idea, please realize that it's going to take quite a bit of time. But I am not an advocate of reinventing the wheel. So feel free to reach out to any of us or any other colleague you may have who's already done something virtually and see what they are willing to share. A lot of the time is in setting up the templates that you need to have in order for things to run smoothly. So if somebody's already done that work, why should you do it twice? You may want to consider reaching out and asking for people to share their documents.
Caryl, thank you. I think that's really important to emphasize. Our contact information is available. You can reach out to us. And if anything, I think we have learned a lot about generosity. And I've encouraged my interns specifically not to be afraid to reach out to other people, to experts at other places, to people that they might have thought, oh, am I bothering this person if I'm asking for advice or help? But I think that that's something that it never hurts and is really exciting when we can help each other improve our field, improve each other's pathways along our professional development. So I thank again Caryl, Hillary, Sara, and Deandra for joining for this conversation today. And I thank you all for the great questions and for your attention and for your interest in being a part of these internship and fellowship programs, whether it's something that's already going on or something that you're building or developing or changing or keeping alive through a rough patch here. We are all doing great work and it's really exciting. So before you go away, I'm going to turn it back to AAMC and thank them for being the host for today's conversation.
Hello, I'm Monica Valenzuela, Program Manager for AAMC and AAMC Foundation. Thank you for joining our program today, and a special thanks to our speakers for sharing their experience and expertise with us. A recording will be available on our website, artcurators.org, and our YouTube channel shortly. Please help support our capacity to continue programs such as today's event by making a donation today. A gift of any amount will have a direct impact on our work. Thank you, stay well, and join us again soon.